Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm deputizing for Ivona Kurz at this very important and interesting session. The title of the session is Looking at, Looking Away, the testimony of in Holocaust photographs. And I think that Holocaust research has relied primarily on documents in the form of texts and on survivor testimony in various media. Photographs, most of which were taken by the perpetrators, have been used in many ways. And what we're going to look at today is how to understand them and how to analyze them. We have three very good presenters, people who are well acquainted with the study of photographs and with the use of photographs. And I'll introduce them in turn. The first speaker is Valérie Hébert. She's Associate Professor of History and Interdisciplinary Studies at Lakehead University, Orillia in Ontario, where she teaches modern European history, Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and the photography of human rights violations and international conflict. She's published on the Nuremberg trials, Rwanda's Gacaca tribunals, and the German resistance fighter Kurt Gerstein. She's led international and interdisciplinary workshops on Holocaust and atrocity photography at the USHMM and at the Lessons and Legacies Conference on Holocaust Studies. In 2020, she was awarded a Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada Insight Grant for the monograph project 5 Shots from Stalgunov, Photographs of the Holocaust by Bullets. And what she's going to be talking about today is Silent Witnesses, the Szkede execution photographs. Dr. Hébert.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm honored to be part of this gathering.
Mr. Poloński and Mrs. Głowacka, can you turn off your microphones?
So yeah, I was hearing some feedback. I think we're okay now. In December 1941, German SS and police and their local collaborators shot 2,749 Jewish men, women, and children at a beach in Szkede near Liepaja, Latvia. 12 photographs recorded the violence of that day. In 1971, former members of the security service were tried in Hanover for their participation in the shooting. The judge in the case called the 3-day December action, quote, of a kind that is hardly humanly imaginable. These photographs, in their unflinching gaze, show us how it was. And still, they are only mute fragments. Sources tell us that upon arrival at the beach, many of the doomed cried, collapsed, and begged for their lives. At the shooting site, mothers with infants were instructed to hold their babies above their shoulders so that the shooters could aim at the babies' heads. These photographs show us many things, but not everything. But for the hand of chance, these photographs likely would have remained in obscurity. David Zivkon, a Jewish electrician and mechanic employed by the German police, discovered the film negatives while conducting repairs for an SS officer. Zivkon grasped the significance of what he had found and further recognized some of the people shown. Consequently, he smuggled them out, had copies made, and surreptitiously returned the originals where he had found them. He hid the prints, and after the war handed them over to Soviet investigators. They are an incredibly rare source, not only because of the official prohibitions against taking such photographs, but also because we can identify several of the victims by name. I'm going to take you through all 12 photographs, and then I'll be returning to some of the individual images to look further into the details of them. I have recently completed editing a collection of essays on these photographs. My colleague, friend, and co-panelist, Dorota, is one of the contributors, and she will be speaking to one of the photographs in this series in our time together today. The book emerged from Regarding Atrocity, Photography, Memory, and Representation, a workshop that I convened at the USHMM. Photographs have no singular disciplinary home. Art criticism, literature, art history, cultural and media studies, photojournalism, history, anthropology, law, political science, museum studies, among other fields, all use photographs. The workshop revealed that our most productive discussions occurred when, as a group, we focused our analytical energies on a single photograph or photograph series. These conversations threw the disciplinary backgrounds of participants into sharp relief and helped us to see more in the images in new and insightful ways. These discussions repeatedly demonstrated the richness of even a single image and the benefit of approaching the same material from different disciplinary angles. The contributions to the book show how enduringly valuable these photographs are, and not only because they help us to understand what happened on the Latvian seashore that day. Contemplation of these images helps us to navigate the complex relationship between photography and violence, suffering and death across space and time. What do the Skjede execution photographs show? Men, women, and children tightly huddled on a scrubby landscape, people undressing, women and a child lined up, half dressed, naked women walking, naked women running, women and children walking on a beach, women and children lined up on the edge of a corpse-filled trench facing the sea, those same women and children lying dead. In many of the photographs, armed, uniformed guards. 4 German members of the SS, Karl Emil Straught, Erich Handke, Wolfgang Kugler, and a man known only by his surname, Sobeck, have been implicated as the photographer. The film negatives were found in Sobeck's possession. Should you look these images up in the photo archives of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem, or the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, you will most often see Straught named as the photographer. Indeed, Latvian witness testimony placed him at the scene with a camera. They named others as well. The record is unclear. We know only that the negatives were found in Sobeck's possession. Now, as researchers, we can get hung up on the inconsistencies and gaps as to the photograph's provenance. Certainly, it would be valuable to know who the photographer was, if by that we could uncover more about his intentions. But even these orphaned photographs have meaning. They can teach. Whoever the photographer was, visual cues tell us that he worked in the open with purpose and confidence. The images are composed and focused. Most of the horizon lines are level. He moved around the scene, covered at least 100 meters of distance. Time elapsed between shots. He actively engaged some of his subjects and did not avoid those men whom his camera linked to the day's violence. I teach a course on the photography of human rights violations and international conflict. In it, I dedicate time to discussing the process of photography. Students, and perhaps some of us here, are accustomed to taking photos with our smartphones, point and touch. The phone does the work for us. Today, photographs are vanishingly cheap, instantaneous, and limitless in their reach. Older cameras, however, were little machines that required manipulation, steps, adjusting the lens to focus the image, adjusting shutter speed and aperture to account for light conditions, depth of field, and film sensitivity. Film had a finite number of frames. It was expensive. It could be hard to acquire and difficult to process. I emphasize these things because they remind us how much more intentional and deliberate photography of this era was. To take a photograph involved a series of decisions. It represented the spending of a limited resource, and it took time. Danny Hoffman, a former war photojournalist, contributed a chapter to our book on Shkeda, and he walks the reader through the choices the photographer would have made, from where he placed himself to what he focused on, and the possible meanings that those choices suggest. On the question of motivation, we don't know why these photographs exist. Within the vast visual archive of the Holocaust, they belong to a subset of images that capture the killing process. German SS and military authorities issued repeated prohibitions against their men photographing mass executions. Yet individuals regularly ignored and took photographs for personal reasons. SS Sergeant Hans Baumgartner, tried in an East Berlin court for his role at Shkeda, claimed that the presence of a delegation of high-ranking military and SS men prompted the photographs. That is, it was a special occasion, and the photographs were intended to document and perhaps show to others an exemplary shooting action. Baumgartner stated that Straught even arranged a group portrait of the SD execution detail. His testimony conjures the ritual of taking a winning team photo. That image has not been found. By contrast, others claimed that the photographs were taken to, quote unquote, prove that local Latvian police were responsible for the liquidation, because indeed all the perpetrators in the surviving photographs are Latvian. Other witnesses testified that members of the shooting commando shared copies of the photographs and kept them for personal revisits. Perhaps they were trophies, proud mementos of a job done well. Perhaps they served other appetites. That half of the 12 images focus on naked and partially clothed Jewish women suggests a pornographic motive. In this connection, Dorota's contribution to the book focuses on the images of naked and partially clothed women, setting them in the context of how women's bodies have been depicted in Holocaust photography, sometimes for titillation, other times for bizarrely placed reverence, other times still for ridicule. Tanya Kinzel's chapter speaks to the inscription of violence upon these photographs and explains how viewers can both recognize and reject the perpetrator's degrading gaze. Hilary Earle lays out a pedagogical exercise where students use these photographs to question the limits and challenges of historical evidence and connect these documents to their own relationship with photography. Returning to the images, a third of the photographs include children caught at a moment of terror. In one, a boy looks in fear at something happening outside the frame. In another, a girl hides her face from the photographer. In the third, children look up the beach to the shooting site where killings are underway. In the fourth, a little girl only seconds away from being shot herself holds her mother's hand and peers over her shoulder at the bodies in the ditch. Of all the moments available to the photographer, why did he choose to preserve these? One such image could be an accident. 4 suggest preoccupation. Indeed, in the latter two, we know that the photographer followed these children to their last moments. Whom do we see in these images? A few of the women and children have been identified, but again, contradictions linger. The women, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but the woman in the center of the photo of the left, on the left, and in the photo on the right, the woman second from the right are most commonly identified as the same person, Mia Epstein. For Dan Newman's chapter in the book, which focuses on the history of the Jews in Liepaja and the immediate context of the shooting, we obtained passport photographs of some of the people pictured here. The passport photo is at the center of the slide that you're seeing. And when you compare, it seems clear that the woman in the photo on the left is Mia. The woman second from the right in the photograph on the right is not. This passport photo of Emma Epstein also suggests that she was captured again that day in 1941. She is on the extreme right, and she is captured again in another photograph in the series. We recognize her from her underwear and the length of her hair. This is Rosa Epstein. The passport photo allows us to identify her in the photograph on the right, which is probably the most infamous of the series of 12. Next to her is her daughter, Zarela. This photograph captured members of the Grinfeld family. From right to left, 15-year-old Ruben Aaron, his sister Esther Liebe, she was 13. You see her turned around in the image. Their mother, Ita Baila, she was 38. And the sister, Silla, only 9. We see only her legs poking out between the figures more prominently shown. We see this group twice more. Lined up at the shooting site and then lying dead. Newman's chapter highlights the challenge of restoring identity to both perpetrators and victims, even though the photographic evidence is so closely tied to both. The photographs would not exist without the perpetrator. The privilege of his position allowed him to get close to and document the action. The photographs, in turn, are incredibly precise about whom they capture. We see individuals, we see faces, yet they are mute, and the evidence needed to decipher them is limited. Adding to the issue of photographs' layered meanings, Marilyn Campo authored a chapter on the Soviets' capturing of the images. With a view to emphasizing the political motivations of the Nazi assault on the USSR, the Soviet investigators who first received the prints used Bolshevik-inspired language of class, not race, to refer to the people in the photographs. Thus, we see how the processes of erasure of the victims' identities continued even after their bodies were destroyed. Of the 12 images, there are only 3 where one or more of the subjects appears to be aware of the photographer. In one of these, the one on the left, this might have been accidental. It shows 5 women naked walking to the shooting site. The quality of the photograph suggests that it was taken hurriedly. The camera is at a slight angle, the image unfocused. And you see on the extreme left, there is a woman who looks back at the camera, but it's not likely that she was the photographer's priority in composing the frame. He may not even have noticed her seeing him when he tripped the shutter. The other 2 photographs, however, hint at a deliberate visual exchange. There are clues that suggest the photographer's presence lasted longer and was more intentional. He centered the subjects in the frame. He stood directly opposite. The images are focused. His subjects are still and face forward, in contrast to the people around them, other Jews in the process of undressing and Latvian auxiliaries who oversee the scene. The latter are caught mid-motion or are standing and looking in different directions. In the middle photograph, Mia Epstein sits amongst heaps of clothes, arms crossed over her breasts. She looks straight into the camera, although on second glance, perhaps she's looking through it, staring into the distance, but seeing nothing. The photographer's intervention may have been slight, stopping only long enough to adjust the camera and waiting for, or at least not avoiding, her gaze. The next photograph suggests a greater degree of manipulation. Here we see 4 women and a girl lined up, all but one looking back at the photographer. They have been drawn away from the activity behind them and arranged in a row where the clothing thins out on the ground. In the middle photograph, although Mia may have only glanced up momentarily, for the photographer to hold the attention of 4 women and a child would have taken a longer, coordinated effort. For Dan Magalow, this photograph holds particular significance. The paradigm of the beach holiday photograph is reflected in the setting and composition of this atrocity image. Echoing Wendy Lauer's point about a more expansive definition of family portraiture and Holocaust photography, Magalow notes that photographic paradigms, in this case, having people pose as if for a holiday souvenir print, these practices persisted even amidst extraordinary circumstances. The continuity of pre-war aesthetic and cultural conventions, even into the context of genocide, mirrors the banality of evil thesis. Inasmuch as making atrocity photographs could have been an unstudied reliance on habit and reflex, so too might the act of murder have been carried out without hesitation or an arresting conflict of conscience. This observation does nothing to detract from the day's horror, rather it amplifies it. My chapter addresses in depth the ethical quandary of engaging Holocaust photography and focuses on this same photo. Of all the Shketa photographs, this is the only one where we clearly see a subject actively trying to hide their face from the camera. When we look at a photograph, any photograph, we stand where the photographer stood. Their perspective becomes ours. Perpetrators deployed cameras as weapons to deepen their subjects' humiliation and as a privilege of their domination. Their victims may look back at the lens, but the circumstances negate consent. Moreover, the images in their immutability extend the violence and degradation in perpetuity. They represent suffering without end and without purpose. In December 1941, the little girl hid her face from the photographer. Today, she hides her face from us. How do we justify looking anyway? Against the claim that photographs taken by perpetrators can only replicate and extend the violence, critics have argued forcefully that an image's meaning changes according to who is viewing it and why. Writing about lynching photographs, Sean Michelle Smith notes that the same photographs that celebrated white supremacy, dehumanized victims, and intimidated Black leaders were used by those very same leaders to expose and condemn racism and as a rallying cry for change. Susie Linfield similarly rejects the notion that Holocaust photographs can only fortify fascist values. Instead, she writes, they are, quote, self-portraits of Nazi degradation. Moreover, as humanitarian activists have long known, secrecy and invisibility are the enemy of justice. The mass circulation of photographs has been an effective tool in holding states to account for their crimes. They have helped solidify our beliefs about what is right and what is wrong. Even for those beyond judicial reckoning, a photographic record of what they suffered at a minimum serves to preserve the victim's memory. Mendel Grossman, who surreptitiously chronicled the lives, deaths, indignities, and despair of his fellow Łódź ghetto prisoners, noted that some of his subjects wanted to be captured in their abject condition. The father of a family whose job it was to collect and transport human feces told him, quote, let it remain for the future. let others know how humiliated we were. Susan Sontag writes, quote, "Remembering is an ethical act, has ethical value in and of itself, because memory, achingly, is the only relation we can have with the dead. Where justice fails, truthful memory is our obligation." Returning to our question of how we justify looking at Sorella's photograph, it collapses the remoteness of history and the abstraction of ideology. This image individualizes the Holocaust. Even when directed at millions, atrocity is inflicted one by one. Linfield refers to the, quote, "terrible loneliness of suffering." In showing a child's experience of persecution, the photograph reveals not only the horror of Nazi ideology, but also its ruthlessness. The photograph tells us about perpetrators too, not just their delusions. They were also human, and thus we are capable of the same cruelty. Whether they draw our attention to victims or to their oppressors, the Shkeda photographs have valuable lessons to teach. If we want to understand that day and the genocide of which it was a part, so that it may steer us toward a better world, we must come to grips with all its painful remnants. Moreover, we do well to remind ourselves that the Nazis intended not only to destroy the Jews, but their memory and the evidence of their destruction. Keeping these photographs public undermines that project. Finally, it must be said that the child hid her face from the photographer, not from us, nor from history. The photograph unwittingly preserved her memory. Thank you very much.
Mr. Polonsky, are you with us?
I think I wasn't. So I'd like to say what a moving presentation this was and how painful it was to watch. As you said in your presentation, Dorota was one of the people who contributed to this volume, and she's going to be speaking now. She's the Professor of Humanities at the University of King's College in Halifax, where she teaches critical theory, gender theory, and Holocaust and genocide studies. She's the author of Potamte Stronje, Świadectwo, Affekt, Wyobraźnia, From the Other Side, Testimony, Affect, Imagination, and Disappearing Traces, Holocaust Testimonials, Ethics, and Aesthetics. She co-edited Imaginary Neighbors, Mediating Polish-Jewish Relations After the Holocaust, and Between Ethics and Aesthetics, Crossing the Boundaries. And she also edited a special issue of Culture Machine entitled Community. Her current research focuses on gender and genocide and on the intersections of the Holocaust and settler colonial genocides in North America. Her presentation today is reframing gender representations of female bodies in Holocaust photographs. Dorota.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Valerie. I'm also deeply moved, which impedes my ability to deliver my own paper. I'm talking about how the depictions of female bodies in iconic Holocaust photographs, whether in perpetrator photography, photographs from the ghettos, or photographs from the liberation of the camps, were shaped by traditional conceptions of gender and sexuality. Gendered conventions also influence the way photographed images of women have been appropriated in practices of memorialization, dictating which images circulate in the post-memorial landscape and which ones are excluded from the socially sanctioned frameworks of memory. So I'm very interested in the images from Schede, and I will return to one of them later. But here I will discuss these gender topoi on the example of a different iconic Holocaust photograph, which was taken in Auschwitz-Birkenau shortly after the liberation, so from the perspective of the liberator. I will contrast it with another photograph which appeared in a photo album in 1945, but which was not reproduced in memorial publications. If I can have my next slide, please. I first encountered this iconic image on the inside cover of the book of poems entitled Nożyk Profesora by acclaimed Polish poet and playwright Tadeusz Różewicz. Nożyk Profesora was written as a tribute to his friend, who was a prominent Polish historian and theorist of art, and a survivor of Nazi concentration camps. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Różewicz shortly after the publication of the book, and I actually asked him why he had chosen this image. Różewicz said that he had seen the photograph shortly after the war, and it had haunted him ever since because, as he said, ta kobieta jest taka piękna. This woman is so beautiful. Later, I saw this photograph reprinted in Holocaust Memorial publications. I now know that it belongs to a set of 32 pictures taken by Polish photographer Henryk Makarewicz shortly after the liberation of the camp with his 35mm Exacta Varex camera. And already before the war, Makarewicz was well known in Poland as a photographer. In 1944, he was recruited by the film crew of the Polish Berlin Army, which had accompanied the Red Army during its liberation campaign. On January 27, 1945, they arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Makarewicz was instructed to film various sections of the camp, including crematoria ruins and the Canada barracks for the Soviet Commission investigating Nazi crimes. The amount of existing visual material from the liberation of the camps in the East by the Soviet troops is limited compared to the abundance of images from the camps liberated by the British and American armies. And the existing Soviet liberation images were regarded with suspicion in the Western media, withheld from larger circulation. Needless to say, there were few amateur photographers with cameras in the knapsacks among the soldiers of the Soviet and Polish armies. So the iconic images of the liberation of Auschwitz, children displaying camp numbers, prisoners greeting Soviet soldiers at the main entrance to the camp, mostly come from the Soviet Chronicle, which was filmed over a period of several months, and the scenes showing the survivors were staged post factum. So among the 32 photographs in Makarewicz's Auschwitz-Birkenau series, I identified 4 that appear to coalesce into a visual narrative. The first one that he originally captioned, the general view taken from the watchtower at the main gate. You see the rows of barracks, which are dwarfed by a snowy expanse of the main camp road. Now in the next one, the camera moves away from the camp entrance and gets closer to the ground, revealing bodies of prisoners partly covered with snow. The caption read, "The tray of evacuation marked by bodies every few steps. Those who fell were killed on the spot." The third image in the series indicates that the photographer has moved even closer to the frozen bodies, and walls of the barracks are now partly visible in the frame. In the foreground, a woman dressed in a short-sleeved dress is lying face down in the snow among a pile of items of clothing. Further down and to the right, we see a naked body of another woman, one leg slightly bent at the knee, and the caption read, "Some more leftovers." The last photograph in the sequence is a close-up of the same woman, supine in the snow in front of the barracks and naked, except for the short cardigan covering part of her torso, its dark color contrasting with this pristine whiteness of the snow, if I may have another photograph. So this is the well-known photograph that caught Różewicz's attention. And only now do we realize that the version reproduced by the poet had been cropped. Part of the wooden structure appeared in the frame on the cover of his book. Only a part appeared, so it was impossible to tell that it was a barracks, which camouflaged the image's location. The woman's face is slightly turned toward the camera. Her eyes appear to be open and gazing upwards, creating an illusion that the woman is alive. This uncanny effect is intensified by the placement of her hands, one resting on her heart, the other on her stomach, exposing the right breast. The focal point of the camera of the photograph is the woman's pubic area, and her legs, slightly apart, are perpendicular to the dark crevice of the barracks door. None of the other bodies are visible in this shot, so the photographer must have positioned the camera so as to obscure the body lying next to the woman. This was visible in the previous photograph, or perhaps he rearranged the corpses to enable this unique shot. The original caption, "One of the bodies that did not reach the ovens," is jarring, since this peacefully reposing woman does not seem to belong in the landscape of horror, random death, and devastation. And the tranquility of this composition stands in stark contrast to the chaotic scenes that greeted Soviet and Polish soldiers who arrived at the camp. They encountered about 7,000 emaciated prisoners, unable to move around or wandering, foraging for food and clothing. An estimated 600 corpses were strewn in every corner of the camp complex. So this tranquil composition of Makarevich's photograph, which unmoors the woman's body from its surroundings, belies the reality of the camp. Even the barracks loses its meaning as part of the camp facilities, its door invitingly ajar. It could be a door of a shed on a farm anywhere in Poland. Against its dark backdrop, the woman's body is peacefully held by the wide expanse, belying the indignity of the body's inevitable destination in a mass grave. According to Marta Zawodna, confronted with the incomprehensible spectacle of devastation, the liberators immediately set themselves to the task of restoring order, and most importantly, by separating the living from the dead, which culminated in the burial of the remains in 3 mass graves. In Makarevich's photo, however, the realms of the living and the dead are confounded. It's only the viewer's later knowledge of the conditions of the camp at the moment of the liberation that attests that this portrait is indeed post-mortem. Considering that this photograph was taken by a member of the liberating army, it is disconcerting that the pose of the woman in this photograph reminds me of a disturbing picture, which I will not show here. I saw it in a paper by Elisa Mainlander, and it shows a group of German soldiers in an unknown location in the East, amusing themselves with a spectacle of one of the comrades pretending to engage in a sexual act with a local woman. Similar to Makarevich's photograph, it's impossible to determine whether the woman is alive or dead. Whether she's coerced to participate in sexual acts or whether her remains are being horridly desecrated. The similarity of how the female bodies are arranged in the 2 photographs is striking. In the mock rape photograph, the woman is also lying on the ground with one leg bent at the knee, slightly thrust to the side, arms folded on her chest and stomach, her face slightly turned upward and toward the viewer. In Western iconography, this pose is distinctly recognizable as a signifier of female eroticism and sexual submission. And Mainlander refers to this mock depiction of rape as a trophy photograph, one of many that in the Nazi East served to shore up colonizers' imperial power and virility, as it was epitomized in the sexualized image of a woman whom the soldiers had hunted and possessed. And of course, the context and intent of the Auschwitz-Birkenau photograph are very different. In the rape photograph, the woman is put on display as an object of mockery. The woman in Makarevich's image is solemnly beautiful, like Eurydice arrested on the threshold of death. Her unseen gaze conjures desire. Although her pose alludes to sexual submission, the peaceful, sorrowful ambiance keeps at bay the odium of necrophilia that, in the rape photograph, enhanced its titillating effect. Yet, Makarevich's photograph can also be conceived as a trophy that recreates the power dynamic of hunting. The female cadaver has been carefully picked out from amongst the frozen figures scattered in the snow. As we follow what I have identified as a narrative sequence, the camera's prowling closer to the body, circling it before taking a shot. The woman's single item of clothing highlights her nakedness, making it appear as if the camera were undressing her before the viewer's eyes. This is a perfect capture. Wondering why we are drawn to images of mass atrocities, Susan Sontag ruminated that images of the repulsive can also allure. But the woman in Makarevich's photograph has none of the ambiguous features of the abject. It is alluring in its unblemished beauty. The scene is symmetrically arranged. The woman's body as its main horizontal vector crossed vertically by the axis marked by the crack of the door. And since the framing of the shot eliminates all the other elements of the camp, the photograph works to recompose its decomposed, abhorrent locale. By the same token, however, it fails as a document of the Nazi crimes. It seems that the sight of the woman's body lying in the snow in front of the barracks interrupted the photographer at his appointed job, seducing him into following his artistic vocation. And this topos of the beautiful dead woman in this photograph very quickly often appears in the works of May visual artists, both those who had been themselves incarcerated in the camps, such as David Oller, a former Sonderkommando in Auschwitz, or Boris Lurie, a survivor of Buchenwald, very frequently in the work of artists who did not witness the events firsthand, but who were deeply affected by the liberation photographs they had seen on the front pages of Western newspapers in the spring of 1945. So one quick example here, Hyman Bloom, a Jewish-American artist. These are his paintings from the Cadaverous series, which were influenced by the images in the liberation photographs. The first one is Torso and Limbs, which depicts a female torso curved upwards, exposing the breasts, with one leg with an elongated foot thrown to the side, suggesting physical and sexual violence, but also sensuousness and beauty. And a similar aesthetic animates Bloom's female cadaver, which shows the autopsied body cut wide open from the sternum to the crotch and arranged in an erotic pose, strongly reminiscent of the positioning of the woman's body in both photographs I talked about. So within Western aesthetic canons, Makarevich's photograph is clearly recognizable as belonging to the convention of female nudes. And in terms of artistic achievement, it is perhaps one of his finest works. Feminist art historian Griselda Pollock notes that eroticized images of women in Holocaust photographs have become iconic because they carry the weight of mythic association of feminine beauty and death. For a masculine subject, the erotic aestheticization performs a ritualistic function of deflecting a confrontation with his own mortality. In the context of mass atrocities, the topos of the female nude, imbued with the sexualized charge of Thanatos, perhaps works to pacify the horror. And it is likely that this culturally encoded trope has this apotropaic function in Makarevich's photograph. Such aesthetic impulse in a Holocaust photograph, however, is also disquieting because it blurs the distinction between what we saw in the photographs from Schede as the perpetrator's fetishistic enjoyment of the spectacle of death and the liberator's horrified and compassionate gaze, the distinction that the later viewers of these images want to preserve at all costs. So in contrast, let me briefly return to one of the photographs from Schede. And this one shows the backs of two women being led by a Latvian policeman, one of which Valerie identified as Emma Epstein. This negative was corrupted, but you can see that the shot was calibrated to show the woman's large buttocks right in the center. And the indignity of the fleshy nakedness is accentuated by a girdle, the only garment she's wearing. So why in the other iconic photograph of the four women and a girl, the female subjects were enveloped in the camera's prurient gaze, this woman is the object of scornful merriment, and her stooped paint posture and the tension in her buttocks index her humiliation. And when I talked to Valerie about these images, Valerie reminded me of this image when I shared with her 2 heart-wrenching images of an unknown woman, which I found in a 1944 photo album. And they bear a caption, Oświęcim, a massacred Jewess. And they show what appears to be an older, heavy-set female. In the first photograph, she's standing in front of a brick building, naked from the waist down, her upper body partly covered with a sweater. She's looking directly at the photographer, and her breasts are protruding through the holes as if deliberately torn in the sweater. A fold of flesh is hanging over her stomach, and her pubis is fully exposed above her heavy legs that appear to be covered with bruises and stretch marks. In the second photograph, she's shown awkwardly limping away, and her large buttocks are also positioned exactly in the center of the frame. So if these 2 images were taken by a German soldier as a perverse version of a trophy photograph, one can almost hear the roars of laughter. So I find it useful to contrast this visual representation with Makarevich's photograph of a beautiful woman. It is unimaginable that this photo would have been chosen by Różewicz for the inside cover of his book. And I have not encountered this photograph of massacred Jewess anywhere else. I have not been able to trace its origin. Excluded from the traditional repertoire of Holocaust images of female suffering, this depiction has never settled into collective Holocaust imaginary or become the object of scholarly inquiry. The older women's bodies, abandoned outside familiar representational frames, remain what they were in the Nazi photographs, ridiculed, unattractive, and disposable. As Judith Butler has argued, the areas of experience that do not fit into familiar frames of reference tend to disappear from the viewer's field of vision. Hence, a photograph determines what will count as part of the regiments of representability and what is excluded from the frame. And in turn, these epistemic and perceptual erasures structure the viewer's affective responses, parsing out the lives into those that they grieve for and those to which they remain indifferent. And since abject bodies have never been fully apprehended as lives worthy of living, they cannot be remembered or commemorated, I quote, sustained by no regard, no testimony, and ungrieved when lost. So the juxtaposition between Makarevich's photograph of the beautiful woman and the picture of the tortured Jewess reveals that certain bodies have been abandoned on the threshold of the representable because the images in which they were captured were refracted by gendered conceptions of female beauty, among others. Moreover, although they had been already rearranged in the camera's viewfinder at the moment of photographing, these images were later mapped onto carefully scripted ideologies of remembrance and that dictated collective expressions of mourning. As Hirsch and Spitzer argue, the meaning of photographs never stagnates into a fixed referential framework. Rather, throughout different acts of viewing, photographs, I quote, remain dynamic and fixed as they acquire new meanings in new circumstances. If in Western aesthetics, the nude female body has served as the erotic signifier of beauty, an examination of Makarevich's photograph, as well as of the viewer's later engagements with this image, reveals the violence inherent in the aesthetic tradition that denigrates female agency and objectifies female bodies. In the afterlife of this particular picture, however, we have also witnessed its slide outside the frame within which it was captured, both by the photographer and by later commemorative rituals. The photograph interpellates its viewers, challenging them to question gender-inflected practices of memorialization, as well as epistemic, moral, and cultural impositions that have circumscribed the depictions of women either as passive objects of morbid desire or as murdered bodies of mothers. So I think we can now reinterpret the narrative of Makarevich's pursuit of the perfect shot. We can reverse the trajectory of the gaze and ask, paradoxically, about the power of the dead woman to address the viewer. Perhaps it was her body, as the photographer beheld it in front of the barracks, that in itself resisted the cooptation into the script of the liberation of the camps, with which it was so strikingly incongruous. Perhaps for contemporary viewers, it is the axis of the dead woman's gaze, as it was first reanimated by the click of the camera, that breaks through the symbolic and ideological constraints that have inframed her body. In this radical shift of perspectives, the woman's vulnerability in the photographic exposure is complemented by the viewer's exposure and vulnerability to the woman's eyes' haunting message. And a different sensibility begins to resonate in the viewer who has been displaced from the position of epistemic certainty secured by the frame. This act, which Tina Kampt has called listening to images, I argue, grants testimonial agency to the gaze of the deceased woman from Makarevich's photographs, just as it does to the women, I think, in the images from Szkede. However, the massacred Jewess in this image, in a forgotten image from 1945 Auschwitz album, also looks directly at the viewer, sharing the frame that displayed her as a dehumanizing, humiliated spectacle. Her eyes deliver a powerful message, and I would like the last word to belong to her. Thank you.
Well, thank you again. This was another very moving and deeply disturbing presentation, and the two presentations were well related to each other. The third presenter is Wendy Lauer. She's the John K. Roth Professor of History and Director of the Mgrublian Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College. She chairs the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and served as acting director of the Jack Joseph and Morton Randall Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the USHMM between 2016 and 2018. She's a prolific author. Among her works are Nazi Empire Building and the Holocaust in Ukraine, The Diary of Samuel Goldfarb and the Holocaust in Galicia, and she was co-editor with Ray Brendan of Shoah in Ukraine, History, Testimony, and Memorialization. Her book, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, 2013, was a finalist for the National Book Award. I'm sure that most people have been very much moved by her most recent book, The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed, which appeared this year. The subject of her lecture will be Silent Atrocity Photography as a Collaborator Testimony. Wendy Lauer.
Welcome, everybody. Usually I prefer to go last, but today it's very difficult after those presentations. I feel like we all just need to exhale and think it over and reflect. And I just want to acknowledge my colleagues for their research, which has been, just amazing as far as the theoretical and analytical approaches to these images and the deep study of them. And they're very difficult to work with. As you were presenting, I thought about historiographically the fact that where we're at with visual analysis and how your work is really, moving the field in new directions and how exciting that is and why is it happening now. And I think it's kind of late in our analytical approach, interdisciplinary approach, because the material is really difficult. Like I think it kind of makes sense that it's taking us decades to do this because it is hard to do. Okay, so let me get to my talk, and I want to stay on schedule for all of you. Hopefully this talk will be a little bit more empowering and uplifting because it's about resistance. Okay, so I'm going to open up my screen. Sorry. And here we go. Can everybody see the image?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Where do we look for resistance as a history? Have we paid enough attention to the material culture in the form of the photograph? Think about the basic contours of the atrocity photograph debate that largely was set off by images starting with the Spanish Civil War and then the expansion of the material from World War II and the post-war era. It's centered on the viewer and consumer, and less so on the actual image as it was produced and utilized at the time of the atrocities to document them and suppress them. And resistance is a theme interwoven in it all. These are some images here that are typically kind of iconic Holocaust images that are used in books, that are used in teaching, that are displayed in museums. I'm sorry to kind of put them together in this way, especially the image of liberation of the corpses. But just to give you an idea of what our kind of visual archive is more popularly of the Holocaust, and to what extent we've kind of interrogated these images as potentially part of a story of resistance. And clearly the one in the middle of the little boy with his arms raised at the Warsaw Ghetto in April 1943 is one such image. Now, the perpetrators knew that the photos could be used in the resistance and therefore sought to suppress them, so much so that SS officers could be punished for taking images of the murder, not punished for the murder itself, as we'll see in the Taubner case in a moment, but ordinary witnesses and victims took the photos as evidence of what happened to stoke resistance at the time through the Polish underground and other networks, including official newspapers and propaganda campaigns of the Allies. After the war, atrocity images were key to starting trials and the pursuit of justice. Formerly in the International Military Tribunal, where images such as the ones we just looked at from Liepaja, from Szkeda, were shown and delivered by a Jewish resistance fighter who was, as Valerie explained, a laborer in the Liepaja, David Zivkan, in the Gestapo headquarters. And even informally, when survivors presented atrocity images, whether taken by perps or ordinary witnesses who sought justice to inform the world of the horror, the images themselves contain that potential because they are images of murder, including mass murder. They were repugnant, and as Lynn Hunt and Sharon Slovinsky and others have elucidated, their content is eliciting a response to support or resist. And for those who wanted to resist in some way, photography was surely one. My presentation will stress the historical agency of the photograph during and after the Holocaust. Since Susan Sontag's provocative, indignant book on photography was published, the debate over the ethics of the photographer has given way to nuanced theories, drawing from Walter Benjamin, Roland Barthes, and continuing with more recent studies by Didi Huberman, among others. The many facets of the image as a cultural aesthetic object, historical evidence, and as an act of bearing witness, as a memory, as an artifact of trauma, as an icon or anomaly, all of these have been illuminated. In some ways, we're also returning to Sybil Milton's 1980s argument that we must appreciate and study Holocaust photographs as core historical sources to be researched like written documents, not merely as marginal illustrations selected in the final stages of a book's production. Marianne Hirsch's work also stresses the agency of the photograph, but in the personal, most affective experience of memory shared among Holocaust survivors and victims and transmitted to their descendants. As certain photographs from the Holocaust have become iconic representations that lose their grounding in the past, scholars have warned against the temptation to overinterpret images such as the Warsaw Ghetto Boy with his arms raised. Some critics have pointed out the importance of understanding Holocaust photography as a genre clustered around certain periods, whether it's liberation or in certain forms, such as the photo album, the Stroop Report, the Hooker album. In 1945, Eisenhower, during the liberation of the camps, had ordered that visual evidence be collected to guard against forgetting and disbelief. The photograph was invoked as the force for remembering and believing. In Barbie Zelitzer's volume, Visual Culture in the Holocaust, she describes the liberation photos taken by journalists and US soldiers as raw representations of Nazi evil, of corpses and gaunt figures. Pictorial reporters, as they were called in the 1940s, not photojournalists, compiled montages without text. No historical information and captioning seemed necessary, instead producing a visual salvo of headlines from the front rather than an explanation or story. The pictorial headlines were blunt, quote, "This is Nazi evil," or "This is the collapse of civilization." In Stars and Stripes, 1945, "These pictures don't lie," holding up the mirror to the Huns. David Schneer's work on Jewish photographers in the Red Army goes beyond the reportage and evidentiary form of the photograph to a deeper analysis of the image as a form of testimony, arguing that rather than viewing photographs as uncontested bearers of truth, we must conceptualize them as, quote, witnesses that give testimony under interrogation and help make people believe. Like written testimony, photographs bear witness to events as a direct experience. They are authored by the photographer, who decides what his thesis will be, his focal point, his subjects, and how the image will be composed and cropped. However, this form is unlike that created by a witness whose statements are circumscribed by the limits of memory, recall, language, knowledge acquired about the event after the fact, and other cognitive psychosociological influences. Instead, as the photograph is studied over time, the scholar discovers things captured in the image that the photographer perhaps did not see when he or she took the picture. The photographic documentation of the Holocaust is especially rich because the events coincided with the mass production and consumption of the small handheld camera. No longer confined to an indoor studio and prearranged sittings, photography became a widespread cultural and social practice, a new means of mass communication that ushered in the visual age of today. And unlike the stationary tripod cameras that required 5 to 20-second exposures for each photograph and patient subjects who had to pose motionless, the new portable camera captured people in action. The Leica camera was patented in 1925, and the Zeiss Icon Context introduced in 1933. Hobby photography was popular, and photojournalism was coming into its own as a profession. The boom in photography entered into nearly all realms of private and public life, in advertising, political campaigning, books, and print media. Here we see a image, the pocket snapshot camera is something that's supposed to be in the German soldier's knapsack. This is an advertisement from a German military magazine and saying that the optical Panzer, and there's the soldier holding it. It's going to be very durable and withstand shrapnel. Here's an AGFA film. These are from Wehrmacht bulletins and different wartime journals, German ones. This is the film company AGFA, and it's saying that photos will provide that link between the home front and the battlefield. In Nazi-occupied Europe, most photographs were taken in the Eastern Territories in 1942-41, perhaps because Hitler and his allies wished to document what they believed to be a military triumph over their enemies. These were also the peak years of Nazi mass murder operations. The images of dead Jews and Soviet prisoners of war mirrored the anti-Jewish and anti-Bolshevik propaganda at home. The Second World War was not only the most destructive, it was also the most photographed. When the mass killing began in the summer of 41, Nazi leaders feared the explosive potential of these images in counter-propaganda and in stoking resistance. The head of the Sixth Army stationed near Zhytomyr implored soldiers not to take pictures of the mass murder occurring there in August 41. Similar bans were reissued at least 5 times in September and December 41, April 42, and again in June and July 1944. Himmler deployed his SS agents to confiscate negatives and prints, but the repeated issue of the ban obviously reveals that the Nazi leaders could not control the photographing of atrocities. It was an order that was not followed. In fact, one time when Himmler put one of his SS officers on trial for killing Jews against Max Taubner, a Waffen-SS commander, the verdict of the Munich court stated in 1943 that this commander was not to be punished because of the actions against the Jews as such. It stated the Jews have to be exterminated, and none of the Jews that were killed is any great loss. Rather, this SS second lieutenant was guilty of excessive barbarism, unworthy of a man in uniform, which included taking tasteless and shameless pictures, including one of a naked Jewess, and openly bragging about them to his wife and friends back in Germany. The 1943 verdict of the SS court reads, "By taking photographs of the incidents or having photographs taken, by having these developed in photographic shops and showing them to his wife and friends, the accused is guilty of disobedience. Such pictures could pose the gravest risk to the security of the Reich if they fell into the wrong hands." It was the barbaric manner in which Taubner incited others and indulged them in his tasteless atrocity photographs that was deemed a risk to state security and worthy of a 10-year prison sentence. This was the only German wartime trial of this kind. Patriotism, anti-Semitism, lurid fascination with inhumanity, moral outrage at witnessing genocide, myriad motives caused ordinary soldiers to document the spectacles of violence inflicted on Jews, captured Soviet POWs, partisans, forced laborers, and so-called Slavic Untermenschen. Now, my focus on resistance is actually based on this singular photograph, which is also the subject of the book that Professor Polonsky mentioned, The Ravine. This photograph was taken October 13th, 1941 by a Slovakian security guard. I assume that the photographer of this atrocity, the murder of this Jewish family in Mariupol, Ukraine, must have been a collaborator, standing at close range in military uniform, helping to prevent the Jewish family from fleeing, humiliating them with his camera. In fact, I learned that already in May 1943 in Bratislava, the Slovakian photographer was denounced for, quote, making photos that were not permitted and working against the new order in Europe. It was on this occasion that the photographer's name first appears and that the Mariupol photograph became the subject of an inquiry. Lubomir Skrovina, born in 1916, was a radio shop owner in Banska Bystrica and was summoned by the Slovakia State Security Headquarters in Bratislava and interrogated by Filip Lisi, who was in charge of Jewish matters and illegal immigration. Skrovina's profile, as documented in the course of this investigation, was curious. At the end of 1941, he had been discharged from the Slovakian army for health reasons after having served on the Eastern Front in a security division in Ukraine as both a guard and a company scribe. The Slovaks were allied to the Germans, and like the Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, Spaniards, and Finns, participated in Operation Barbarossa. In Slovakia, all males between 16 and 60, age 16 and 60, were required to serve either in the military or as a member of the radical fascist group, the Hlinka Guards. When Skrovina returned from his duties on the Eastern Front, he brought his photographic film, and in his home, where he had a darkroom, he developed these prints of his form, and they included 5 of the prints, or the day that he took this picture, when he went to this mass murder scene, he had enough film to take 8 prints, produce 8 images, and we ended up finding 5. So this is one of them. When he was interrogated in Bratislava in 1943 for, quote, engaging in monkey business with Jews, he was accused of secretly stockpiling materials for the resistance movement. And Skrovina protested that these were false allegations. He admitted that he was in Mariupol in 1941, that he had taken photographs of a mass shooting, and stated, quote, while I was in the military, I took part in the field campaign as a corporal, and in Mariupol, I had the opportunity, these are his words, to see the atrocity of the war when Ukrainian militia and German finance guards used guns against partisans. He referred to them as partisans. Some of the partisans were shot because they resisted. I took pictures of it. After I came back home, I didn't show these pictures to anyone, and later on, I burned them, which he did not. As I didn't want them to end up in the wrong hands. These pictures were taken publicly with the approval of German commanders. Here's a Skrovina in the middle. Actually, the image in the middle was taken in Mariupol in September 1941, about a month before he took the pictures of the mass murder of the Jews of Mariupol. They were killed just at the edge of town. And I can provide more information about that, but I want to focus on the theme of the photographer today. And here he is with his Czech wife in uniform. They got married right before he was sent into action. Now, Skrovina was allowed to return home for the Christmas holiday in December 1941. He ended up feigning illness. He did not want to be sent back to Ukraine, and he joined the resistance. Slovak President Father Tiso had been complying in early 1942, which under German pressure, to deport thousands of Jews to Nazi-occupied Poland. The first Jewish deportees to arrive at Auschwitz were young Slovakian women in March 1942. Jews who were considered more valuable to Slovak society, such as male doctors, received a yellow slip, a dispensation that only Father Tiso could grant, sparing them temporarily from deportations. Skrovina knew that deportation to the east meant death. He sheltered Jews in his home and helped some escape to the forest, including 2 doctors who had these yellow slips. One of them was Skrovina's neighbor, Dr. Gotthilf, an obstetrician gynecologist, and his wife and his 5-year-old son. And when Skrovina's wife became pregnant, Dr. Gotthilf cared for her and in October 42 delivered Lubomir's son into the crossfires of Nazism and Stalinism. Sometime in 1943 or the first half of 44, Dr. Gotthilf joined the medical corps of the Slovak resistance movement and camped in the mountains and forests around Skrovina's home, and Dr. Gotthilf brought his wife and son with him. Slovakia stood in the maelstrom of the struggle over Eastern Europe as Hitler sought to retain the client state and Stalin aimed to extend Soviet communism across Eastern Europe. Our photographer was among the thousands of Slovaks on the ground who participated in the Slovak national uprising from August to October 1944. In his hometown of Banská Bystrica, the center of the resistance, the Slovak National Council declared its will to restore the free state of Czechoslovakia. Yet the lack of coordination of these diverse forces, as well as the Soviet diversion of its promised support to Poland and Hungary, resulted in a tragic defeat. Himmler's Waffen-SS, another Einsatzgruppe, quickly descended on the region in a campaign of terror and reprisals. 100 villages were razed, 5,000 civilians and partisans were killed, and among them was the Gotthilf family. The Gotthilf family was taken to an anti-tank ditch at the edge of the road, shot, and dumped in a mass grave. After months of fierce fighting and public executions, the Red Army gained control over Banská Bystrica. Tiso was taken prisoner. He was sentenced to death and executed in 1947, along with thousands of other Nazi collaborators. Skrovina's military service complicated his profile. He was then kind of hunted down and interrogated after the war in the 1950s. This is when he's talking about the Mirapol photograph. He tells us what camera he actually used. And so now his involvement in the resistance now, he's got to explain this in these post-war interrogations, and ultimately he is recognized for being in the interrogation. But it's these photographs that are the impetus for these investigations and his interrogation. Before Skrovina died 60 years later in October 2005, he did two things related to the photographs. In 1994, in post-Soviet independent Slovakia, he wrote a letter to the Minister of the Interior to request the return of his photographs and negatives of what he called, quote, Jewish civilians executed in Ukraine. This time, he presented a motive for taking the photos. He said he wanted to document the Ukrainians doing the killing. He understood that his image uniquely showed their direct role. Indeed, this was a feature of Skrovina's visual documentation that immediately caught my attention. Jewish survivors described Ukrainian collaborators as the worst, often referring to their brutal excesses as guards at gassing centers. Yet there was nothing in the German wartime documents to indicate that Ukrainians were formed into shooting squads, since officially non-Germans were not supposed to be armed with guns. The Mirapol photograph that I showed you documents very clearly the Ukrainians as shooters using Soviet rifles and shoulder to shoulder with the Germans. Skrovina took a second action toward the end of his life, and here is a post-war image of Skrovina from the 70s, and there's his actual camera. In July 1997, he donated his camera he had used to take that Mirapol photograph to the then newly established Museum of the History of the Jews in Bratislava. And in the donation acknowledgement letter, the museum director stated that the camera would be displayed in a future exhibition on the Holocaust. At the time of his donation, Skrovina urged the museum to find his photographs and negatives in the Czech archives. His 66 negatives were not found. Skrovina's, and now I'm wrapping up, Skrovina's photographs capture what could not be put into words. In Susan Sontag's On Photography, she writes about photographers as conflicted moral agents operating with mixed motives concerning conscience, taste, and the need to document reality. His picture taking may have helped him make sense of the disorienting reality before his eyes, or may perhaps have shielded him by allowing him to turn his gaze from the atrocity itself to the lens, since, as Sontag argued, photography is essentially an act of non-intervention. But this characterization of the atrocity photographer as a passive witness is not entirely in line with what we have uncovered about Skrovina. For him, photographing the event, trying to capture what he called the entire scene, was both an expression of defiance and a turning point. Sontag also argues that the photograph is a material vestige of its subjects, a source for remembering and a stimulus for re-experiencing the event and people in this image. But for this photographer, 25 years old in 1941, the Mirapol event was a turning point for him, and the photographs capture that. He was haunted by what he saw, heard, smelled, and felt. As he wrote to his wife at the time, it felt as if the blackness of his hair was seeping into his brain, turning his hair gray. There was nothing he could do, or so it seemed, to save those victims at that scene in October 41. Being there shaped his subsequent choices and the risks he undertook, affecting himself and his family. And as I described, deciding to show them to the Jewish community and engaging in the resistance. Hannah Arendt described images of the Holocaust as an instant of truth. The Mariupol image became Skrovina's testimony against the fascists, the war, and the mass murder of innocent women and children. As he wrote to his wife, this is material for the resistance to be handled carefully but with resolve. In the history of the Holocaust, no government, no non-Jewish organization, no church openly and consistently launched a campaign against the Nazi genocide of European Jews. The most successful effort occurred at the national level in Denmark, where King Christian X retained his authority and protected Danish Jews from persecution and deportation, ferrying them to Sweden. On the Aryan side of the Warsaw Ghetto, a branch of the Polish underground, supported by the Polish government in exile, issued appeals to provide relief to Polish Jews. Resistance, we have learned in these cases, was enacted mostly in a piecemeal, indignant acts, and also in local collective uprisings. Rescue and relief efforts were undertaken quietly and heroically. The Holocaust was, for Skrovina, the worst event that he could capture on film to communicate just how criminal and terrible the war was. But he and others whose outrage turned to documentation and resistance were swimming in an ocean of censorship and hostility. Resistance to history's most extreme case of genocide did not amount to more than a struggles of individuals, such as Skrovina. As an eminent Auschwitz survivor observed, these efforts, no matter how brave or clever, were like throwing sand in the machinery of death. The resistors and rescuers deserve to be honored, but this should not detract from the disturbing fact that they mostly acted alone because states and international organizations failed them. Thank you.
Well, thank you again. I mean, this was a very moving book, and I think your presentation summarizes exactly what's in the book. There's a lot to be said about photography as resistance, as there is also to be said about photography as documentation of the horrors and indeed participation in them. We have a number of questions. Perhaps I'll pose the questions and you can then maybe sum up at the end. The first question is a question to Dorota. It's about how you feel about Różewicz. If you'd had knowledge of the photograph that Różewicz admired when you spoke to him, would you have felt differently?
Would you like me to speak quickly right now? In the largest...
We have a bit of time. I mean, I think that this is a very serious subject, and I think... Yeah.
I can maybe speak very quickly to not take up too much time. In an extended version of this paper, I have a larger analysis of Różewicz. So it's a kind of longer argument that I make, but the gist of it is that when I interviewed Różewicz in 2002, I was actually quite outraged. I wanted to interview him because I wanted to ask him this question: why did you put this photograph of a naked woman into your book? And I was quite upset about it. In turn, he was upset about me because I was writing an encyclopedia entry about him as a Holocaust writer, and he didn't want to be subsumed under that rubric. So to make a very long story short, many things have happened in the meantime, and I now see Różewicz's engagement with this photograph differently. I still stand by my initial impression that I thought he was aestheticizing this image, drawing on these Western canons of aesthetic beauty in homage to his friend Mieczysław Poremski, art historian. But now, years later, I'm also relating it to Różewicz's own autobiography. I'm relating this analysis to his moving book, Mother Departs, to the fact that his mother was Jewish and his kind of conflicted, she converted to Christianity. Nevertheless, I'm finding these kind of conflicted messages. So now later I see his engagement with the photograph as a kind of maybe unconscious, I don't know what word to use it, but a kind of engagement, kind of tribute to his mother, to make a very long story short. So for me, Różewicz's engagement upon gazing onto this photograph is also in a way, an example of the photograph's testimonial agency as an engaged, first the photographer and then Różewicz. I hope that makes sense, because it's a longer argument that I will make in a longer version of the paper.
No, thank you. Różewicz, a very complicated figure, as was indeed the Slovak Skrobina. But the second question is a question from Dagmara, and it's to all speakers. What's your approach to the use of such pictures in wider sphere of education, different types of reproductions, enlargements in museums? Should we treat this as good documentary material that we can access, or should we rather think about the people on the pictures? Would they accept such use? Would they agree to be remembered in this way? Very often we have anonymous characters in humiliating poses or circumstances. We know nothing more about them besides this terrible shut-in camera momentum. Of course, what's striking about these photographs from Škede is that many of the people were, in fact, identified, which makes the photographs rather more shocking. But I wonder if you could respond to this. Maybe Valerie first.
It's an excellent question, and it's one that I don't know if there's ever going to be a satisfying answer to. But I think, the discomfort we feel, the ambivalence we feel is something that attaches to other sources as well, other, searing verbal descriptions of events. I was struck by the way you phrased the question that, is it good documentary material, or is it something that we should resist because the subjects couldn't possibly have given their consent? And I'm not sure it is that either or. I think it is both. It is good documentary material for all the reasons that photographs make unique contributions to the way we understand something. They're visceral, they're emotive, they are precise, they individualize the Holocaust, they take the abstraction out of 6 million or Nazi racial ideology. But they are themselves exploitative and humiliating, and but I think there's actually value in engaging them for those qualities. Like photographs are themselves the material artifact of a crime. It was another layer of injury to take their photograph, right? So it wasn't just like a mirror reflecting something happening that is somehow disengaged and separate from that persecution, that abuse, that injury, that violence. It itself is another extra act of violence. And so to look at that photograph is to engage with another manifestation of that evidence. And the thing is, the cat's out of the bag. These photographs are out there. You can find Pinterest boards that collect these images together, and they circulate on far darker, horrible websites. And so I think we want to be part of this conversation, and we want to ensure that there is still some critical thought that goes into thinking about them, that it provides the context to viewers about issues, first of all, what was actually happening in this scene that signals the lack of consent, the exploitative and degrading qualities that attach to these images, and that help restore some balance to what it is that we're seeing. So I think, they simply are part of education. They are part of the public consciousness around the Holocaust. And I think it's our responsibility to ensure that they are thought about and talked about and presented in ways that are critical and ethical and respectful.
Well, thank you. I think that's very much evident in your presentation. Dorota, do you want to add to that?
I think about it deeply, and I'm actually quite ashamed of how uncritical I was even 10 years ago when I was showing photographs in my classrooms. I'm much more careful, much more thoughtful. And I really think that before we show these images or exhibit them, they have to be very carefully contextualized. So I put a lot of effort into historical context, into elaborating what my students or viewers see. That's one thing. Again, and also what I was trying to show in my paper is that I think it's important to also scrutinize those kind of unacknowledged frameworks that in here, in the ways we look at those photographs, we have to ask ourselves, why do we look at them? Why do we see what we see? So it's really important to have that critical scrutiny of the viewer's act of looking. And thirdly, referring to Wendy's context, I'm looking also at these moments of resistance in those very photographs. So I look at those kind of moments in the photo. That's why I'm saying the photo itself has a certain testimonial agency. And if we look at it slightly differently, we can tease out those moments where the photograph subjects like stare at you, just like the old woman in my photograph. I'm granting her agency. We look at her differently.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to turn to Wendy because, and to expand on this question with another question from Dariusz Stolar. He writes, thank you for these disturbing and insightful presentations. My question to Wendy, did Skrobyna's interpretation of what his intentions for the photos were during the war evolve in the post-war decades, or did it remain the same?
I think it was it's pretty steadily since that moment. The trajectory of that image pulls forward into his last days and the letters he wrote when he donated the camera, and that outrage and moral outrage. And so, it really was his turning point for him. And and as a 25-year-old trying to shape his own sense of right and wrong and the limits, I think that, became part of his kind of core value system, that this was the limit. This was not any war he would sign up for, and this was what inhumanity looked like. I think he's part of a generation as well that's coming to see, like Lemkin, what genocide is, and putting a name on it, and that was part of his understanding of what he was a part of historically. And he even kind of suggested with his children when I interviewed them that he was kind of warning them. It was always this kind of warning in his mind, this image, the way it haunted him and the way he could kind of recall it. And then he desperately wanted to get those additional negatives because he had taken other atrocity photographs, including images of pogroms, and wanted them to be in public view. So I think that was, there was a really consistent attempt on his part to affirm just how immoral this was, and that this was a kind of limit of humanity. So, or an expression of the extremes of inhumanity. And the fact that he realized as he read about the Holocaust and whatever he had learned about it, that the issue of collaboration. So, in the post-Soviet context, I didn't look at his library, actually, his Holocaust library. I didn't have access to that. But the fact that he was specific about the Ukrainian participation in this was important for him, that he felt like there were things that he had witnessed and even documented were not getting enough attention more broadly, and the educational role of his photograph to him was extremely valuable as well. And I agree with mostly what Valerie and Dorota have said about the question of the ethical use of these photographs. And I don't think it's an either or proposition. I think that if you are building a museum and you're going to put things on display, obviously, you're careful, you make different kinds of decisions, your audience, how long they're going to walk through that institution, their age group. I mean, all these things come into those decisions as to what photographs you're going to select to display. And a classroom setting is very different than that, in a way that you can engage a student and get into deeper critical thinking and address the indignity of these images and the pornographic nature of them and so forth. So that's important to develop in students, definitely in that context, a visual literacy and a kind of critical analytical ability. And I'm hoping that when that's happening in our more of our educational environment, that is going to hopefully, and with our publications, is going to help with the distribution. As Valerie said, the cat's out of the bag. These images are out there. And so we have to have a kind of counter narrative or kind of another way of understanding them, and not just allowing them to appear like the Venus.
I'm sorry to interrupt at this point, but that's a very good point to stop.
Yeah.
And I think that it sums up really what we were trying to do in this panel. And I'd like to thank very much the three panelists. Everything that you said was most moving, painful, helpful. Those who are able to can continue this discussion in the coffee room, and I hope that you'll be able to do so. I know that, Dorota, you have to leave us, but I'd like to thank all the three participants. This was a remarkable panel, and I think that we've all both learned a lot and experienced a lot, and thank you very much on behalf of the audience.